we are here for the online Spring Network for 4EA1 and 4ET1, so International GCSE, English Language A and English Literature. I'm going to be talking about both, and although there's some general slides and then I go into language and then I go into literature, I'll just show you this, maybe make it clearer. If you're only doing literature, I would still recommend staying right through the first section because there are some common points. So lots of people have been asking questions about how to do question 5 comparison on English language paper 1. And lots of people have been asking about how to do comparison for English literature paper 1 with the poetry. So I am going to jump around a bit and talk about both, and it's obviously the same skills. So it probably makes sense for you to stay for everything. On other occasions, it might be that it would be more useful to just hop in once I get to literature. So if you need to communicate with me this afternoon, you can chat into the chat box. I'm not going to answer immediately always because it could interrupt the flow of what I'm saying and my concentration. So I'll talk about something and then I'll pause and ask if there are any questions, and then you are welcome to type your questions into the chat box. It's best if you use the option to the entire audience so that everyone can see what you're asking. If you've got sort of more individual questions, then maybe keep them to the end when some people have gone, or email me at teachingenglish@pearson.com and I will help you. Okay, so let's get started without further ado. I should just say I did send out the notes pages for the slides. I had a few sort of inspirational moments where I added a couple more things in, so they're just sort of more admin-y things, so it doesn't really matter that you haven't got them, but you might just find that that there are a couple of extra slides interrupting the order you're expecting. But if you just bear with me, I think it will be clear where I'm going with things. Okay, so first of all, we've just got some general news on each of the qualifications. So some just general reminders. The legacy qualifications for AO, BO and TO are no longer available. So it was the case that in January 2019, centres outside the UK were still able to sit those. But just to be completely clear, those are now completely withdrawn, and it's not possible to carry forward any element of those qualifications onto the new ones. So you can't carry coursework forward from the old to the new, for example. Deadlines coming up. So for if you're entering students for the summer, you need to do so by the 21st of March. And I'm just going to show you the entry codes in a moment because they are a little bit complicated, especially for language. The coursework and spoken language endorsement, if you're doing it, the sample and marks are due by the 15th of May. And when you get this PowerPoint in due course, there's a link to the submission guidance. I have to confess that I have not yet updated the 2018 guidance, but everything is the same except that the due date is the 15th of May 2019 instead of 2018. The 15th of May date doesn't change from year to year, it always stays the same. In case you haven't seen them, I'm offering some further free online support sessions on the spoken language endorsement in March and also on submitting coursework. So if you want to know, if you want to go through and ask questions about annotation, bibliography, word counts, all that kind of thing, then that would be a good session for you. If you had candidates sitting in January, then the results day is on the 7th of March. And I've just put in this bullet here when the assessment materials will be on the website and the dates when you can make post-results requests. Don't forget that if you are using our free access to scripts service after a series, it is only available for a limited time, and that's always listed in the post-results date. So if you want to download your candidates' scripts with their permission, you do need to do it there is a window, and after that they're no longer available. So it's always worth checking what those dates are. We were waiting rather a long time for exemplars for the language coursework, but I'm happy to say they are now up. Some people were happy to have them, but would have liked a few more. So I am making sure that we collect those from the January series, and we'd hope to get those up much more quickly than we did those from the summer. There's a link here on how to order anthologies. I still get quite a lot of people saying, I'm not sure how to do it. Just a reminder, you can only order them through the stationery box. I'm not going to go onto the link, but if anyone is in doubt, then there's a link also on the English subject page where you can get the steps on how to do it, or wait around till the end and I can go through it again. Just a reminder, can I actually ask, could you put your hand up if you came to the autumn IGCSE network? Just one person? That's surprising. Okay. Okay. So there is a presentation and recording from that event on the English subject page, and I'm not going to go through the examiner reports because I did so there. So if you still wanted to look at what the principal examiners said about the summer series, that's a place to go. And also in relation to that, we have published pre-recorded exam feedback training from the senior team for both of these qualifications. And so if you're looking for advice on how to mark your students' work, that is the best place to go. It's a full-scale training, so you need to download the pack, which is quite extensive, and then allocate time to work through it. It includes things like script marking exercises, so it's very valuable and will answer a lot of questions that you have. And it's suitable for like a departmental meeting where you give everybody the materials in advance and they go through it, and then you watch the training together. Okay, on to English Language A. So in the rest of the session, I'm planning to cover things that people have been asking me about. Okay, so sorry, before we go into the into language, I just wanted to quickly show you the entry codes. So these are quite complicated for English Language A because there is the issue of whether you're carrying anything forward. So you've got the exam only route, option A. You've got exam plus spoken language endorsement, option AE. Exam and coursework, exam, coursework and spoken language, etc. And then you've got the carry forward versions of those. So if one of your students sat this qualification in summer 2018, they can carry forward the spoken language endorsement grade or the coursework mark. So that gives quite a few codes. So these are taken from the information manual, which you can find by just typing information manual into the search engine on the Edexcel website, and then you'll get those up. So that is a very frequently asked question: what are the entry codes? And these are the ones for literature, which are rather more simple because you haven't got the added complication of the spoken language endorsement. I also thought I would just go over the prescribed editions for literature. So these are in the specification. So these are the editions used by the examiners to set questions, write the mark schemes with the indicative content, and you'll find them in the specification, and I've reproduced them here. In fact, for component 1, that is a closed book exam. So if you happen to have a different edition of a component 1 text, that wouldn't matter, but it's up to you because, as I said, the examiners use our prescribed editions and there can be differences. So it is in your students' interest to use the one specified. So that's most of them, and then there's just a couple more. Okay. Good. Now we can go into English language. So just some general reminders about approaching the papers. And again, these are things that lots of questions are asked about. So the space allowed in the paper is an indication of the expected length of the response, and so your students should avoid exceeding it. It sounds obvious, but again, teachers do ask me quite often, are they allowed to exceed it? Well, they can, but your exams officer should have ordered additional sheets, and if they want to exceed the space, then they should go onto the additional sheet, clearly labelling which question they're answering, and then the extra sheet needs to be attached to their script with a treasury tag. Paper 1, so text 1 is on the unseen text and text 2 is on the anthology part 1 text. So these are just very basic things, but it does occasionally happen that students get confused and don't move to the right text for the right question. So questions 1 to 3 are on text 1, so the unseen, and then they need to switch to text 2 for question 4. And then question 5 is the comparison one on both of the two texts. Just some clarifications on the wording, where it changes and where it doesn't. So the exact wording of the questions on 1 to 4 varies. It's not identical paper to paper, but the wording of question 5 is fixed. And you can see these patterns most clearly if you look at the question summaries which I've produced, and I've put the link to that in the PowerPoint. So those will show you, of all the papers that have been set so far, SAM's specimen papers and the 2 papers from summer 2018. So that's 4 papers for you to see how the question patterning works. And when the January 2019 papers are released, I will add those, so you'll have 6 sets of questions to read across to see how the wording is repeated or not. So for question 4, students have already thoroughly engaged with language and structure for text 2 during the course. Yeah, so question 4 is on a text which they have already studied. It's not an unseen text, so they should feel confident about answering their question, the question. But the question has a different focus each series, so they do have to adjust whatever they've learnt about the text which is selected. And I've just summarised here what the focuses have been in the question so far, to create suspense, to show difficulties, to interest and engage the reader, etc. So question 4, they know the text, but they don't know what the focus will be. On question 6 and 7, writing, one of the things that was picked up and people have asked about is that there's a statement and then there's a task. So when the students respond to the whole question, they do need to take into consideration both what the statement says and the form, purpose and audience of the text that they're invited to write in the body of the question itself. If images appear in the question paper, as they did in summer 2018, there was a picture of a bird to accompany the unseen text. Students don't need to, and in fact shouldn't, comment on the picture. The picture, in this case, for example, was not actually published with the text, so it was a kind of illustration. So there aren't any marks for commenting on the picture, so they can ignore them. So now we come on to question 5, and this is where there are obviously links to poetry on the literature paper. I'll just pause for one moment just to see if anyone's got any immediate questions, because I've been speaking for a quarter of an hour or so now. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them into the chat window, and if not, I will continue. I don't plan to go into this one in detail, although I can come back. And the reason for that is because I did look at this in the autumn network, although from the hands that I saw, most of you weren't at the autumn network, so it wouldn't be a repetition in that sense. But instead, I thought I might look at the literature exemplar here. So I also sent you this comparison, and I just thought, I hope you don't find this too strange, but since it doesn't really make it, since the approach is the same, I just thought I would have a look at this exemplar. So if you did print these off, then I should just scroll through and then I'll just talk about it. So this one has got a very good plan. So I think that's one of the things that why I wanted to look at it. And it's why it's relevant to both the question 5 and the poetry comparison. So you can see here how the student has, before they've started to write, they've got the 2 poems and they've got a list of points that they've planned on that they're going to make. And then as they've written, certainly at the beginning anyway, you can see that they've ticked through to say, I've addressed that, etc. So the same approach would apply to the question 5 on the language paper. I'm going to just look at the annotated version of this. So I just marked up a text. Because I think, again, it's going to exemplify for us how to approach comparison. So what people ask me when they talk about these 2 questions on each paper is, what sort of an answer as a board do you prefer? Do you know, is it okay to just write all about one text and then write all about the other, or to write about one text and then to compare the other one, the second one, to the first? How do you suggest that students structure their response? So I just think this example, this student's writing exemplifies a good approach. This is a level 5 response, and it doesn't really matter what the detailed content is, but the markup just shows you the approach to comparison. So we don't have preferred methods of addressing questions, but clearly when students are asked to compare or to link or to look for connections, we are expecting them to think of the 2 texts together and to think of them in relation to a focus, and to move between the 2 texts and to compare and think about what the 2 writers are doing and the techniques that they use. And so it makes sense that the points that students make are that the topic sentences or the discourse markers in the writing are coming out of that idea of looking at 2 texts together and comparing them. So this one was just compare Search for My Tongue and Half Caste, and the focus was compare the ways the writers convey feelings about identity. So I'm just going to scroll through the annotation and just talk you through a little bit, and you'll have this exemplar both annotated and unannotated in the pack when it goes up. So the student starts off with kind of an in a nutshell view of their whole position, as I call it. So whenever you're comparing 2 texts, be they poems or the non-fiction texts in language paper 1, you'd sort of expect the student to have a general view. How do these 2 texts present identities? Can I just very briefly say, yes, they present identities quite similarly, or there are major differences in how they present identities, or this one presents identities in a comical way and this one presents identities in a very serious way. And so a good way to start a comparison response is by flagging for the reader for the reader, the examiner, what your general view is of the two texts together. And obviously it's also good in your in the sort of discourse markers or topic sentences to keep the focus on the question. So this candidate has got a link straight away, presents identities as heavily linked to language. So it's in a nutshell, and both poems are mentioned. They then go on to write something about poem 1, and then they start a new paragraph, and they bring in the second poem. And just through the use of the word also, they link the comparison, they link what they're saying into the first text. So the writer of Search for My Tongue also uses a somewhat accusatory tone. So they're moving to the second poem, but they're keeping the link to what they've said about the first poem. And then they go on to say, addressing the reader. However, this time it's in response to being asked what she means. So this is kind of a differentiated comparison. It's not just they're both using an accusatory tone, it's being very clear about how exactly they're similar or different and qualifying the comparison. So that's a quality of a high level response. Okay, then we go, so this time the new paragraph, the candidate sticks with the second poem, adds another point about it, and the sort of the specificity of the analysis is kept up. So she or he is signposting whereabouts in the poem certain things are going on. They're ranging around the poem in this case, but it could also be a non-fiction text. So she's saying when things happen, just as he or she did in the first stanza. She adds to this idea in the last stanza. So within one of the texts, this candidate is ranging around and showing that they can put points together, think about them effectively. Again here, linking different parts of the poem and the impact of the techniques being used. Then here they come back to the first poem. The writer of Half Caste also uses contrast, so now they're linking to the point that they just made about poem 2. And again, differentiated. However, he does something slightly different. He uses it to further assert. So again, this is adding to their own argument. The candidate has already said that he asserts something, and this is adding to the impact or the point that the writer is making. They link not only by theme but also by technique. The writer of Half Caste also uses a form of contrast. Again, the accumulation of techniques and what the accumulated impact is, further mocking the whole idea. So the candidate already introduced the idea of mocking or making fun of, and now they are adding further evidence of that. And then at the end, they just draw it all together with a simple conclusion, sort of reiterating what has come in the essay so far, and just rounding things off. So I hope that gives a sense of how a good comparison essay, what it looks like, and some of the techniques. I'm not going to go through the prose one straight away. I'm going to carry on, but if anyone wants to, and we've got time left at the end, we can come back to that. So So L asks, am I not just repurposing in the slide that I was looking at before? Well, I was just trying to show the difference, L. I think the overall message is clear that it's not really a shortcut to try to sort of hash what you've written in questions 1 to 4 in your response to question 5. You should take a step back and look at both of the texts as wholes and in relation to the focus that is set for the comparison, and plan a response afresh. Of course, it's still based on what you've been thinking about for the earlier questions, because those are designed to engage students with the unseen text and to give them an opportunity in question 4 to think about the text that they've studied. Okay. So the other thing I wanted to have a look at is AO2, so the analysis of language and structure, or I can't remember the wording without looking it up, but it's slightly different for language for 4EA1, but it's looking at the techniques that the writers use. So in paper 1, question 4, there are 12 marks for AO5, for AO2, and paper 2, question 1, there are 18 marks for AO2. On both papers, a specific question is asked. The wording is not repeated each series, but in both cases, students have been taught the text, so they're responding on text which they've been taught. They do need to comment on both language and structure. Just a few sort of reminders. It should be obvious, but it's not always the case. Students do need to comment on what the impact is of whichever techniques it is that they're picking out. So feature spotting without a comment on effect will not be so effective. They really need to try to go beyond comments like make the reader read on, or make it interesting for the reader, which could be applied to any kind of writing, anything that any writer does, and aren't really specific to the text. Those sort of comments won't take them further than a level 3. So it's probably a good idea to have a look at exemplars with them at both that level and at a higher level to show them what the difference is and how to avoid those kind of very generalized comments. And in terms of when they're looking at text, they will think about who the reader is and how they're being addressed. So they'll think about, where this text might have appeared and the audience that it might be being written for, and take that into consideration, have that in the back of their mind when they're writing on it. So characteristics of level 5 responses on AO2. They consider the type of text, as I've just mentioned. They use discriminating references, specific examples across the text that link to their point rather than commenting on every feature seen. It can be tempting for students to kind of pick out the more familiar or more sort of obvious techniques like alliteration, simile, metaphor, etc. And these work well, but they also need to try to be aware of more subtle features. So not necessarily more complex, but just something like, for example, the way that pronoun variation might impact on the reader. So I've just put a kind of short example point here at the bottom of the slide. Along with the movement between we to show togetherness and I to show the writer's personal involvement earlier in the extract, in the final paragraph, MacDonald includes a description of herself in the third person, showing how the man would have seen her, and the reader is invited to pity the woman alongside him. So sort of the idea of pronouns is not complex in itself, but being aware of how they might change and how that might have an impact on the reader is a sort of a more high level skill, which is more typical of level 5 responses. So that was in relation to H is for hawk again. Okay, so I've got one more. I've come to the end of my language section. There, I've got one question outstanding, which is 2. In the question which requires students to use their own words, should the students analyse language and structure, or just sum up? I would need to know which question you're referring to, because it's not immediately obvious to me. I do have some papers here. I can have a quick look, unless you know the number of the question. I think the answer is probably no, they don't need to do language and structure, because they would be asked to do that directly if that was the case. But I'm just quickly scanning. So the exemplar from actually, that's the little bit that I just read on H is for hawk. So this is in relation to Becky's question. I just part of that is from the examiner's report, I think, and then I just extended a bit. So that's actually me. So that's an example. I've just written that example myself, but I think that's where it comes from. But you've got exemplars in the pre-recorded training. There's a whole pack of them there. So if you're looking for exemplars on H is for hawk, you'd find them there. Just quickly checking. Oh, so you were, so I think the question about using your own words is in relation to question 2, where it says, in your own words, describe what the writer does in Bhutan, for example. That was the R paper. That's a 4-mark question. So no, it's not necessary to do language and structure analysis on that question. AO2 is not assessed. And Rosie's just checking about how many papers are available. There are 4 in total. So there are the sample assessment materials, the specimen paper, and then from summer 2018, there is the standard paper, and then there's also the regional paper. So I could just show you these. Hopefully I won't lose all of my setup here. Just one moment. So this is the English language page. So if you go to course materials, teaching and learning, and here, so under qualification guides, summary of question styles. So these are the 4 papers. So I've just summarized the how the questions have been set, and I'll be adding the January ones. So they're in different pages. So that's why it's not always immediately easy to find them. But I can just quickly show you before moving on to Lit. So the sample assessment materials are here. So those were the first set, but I wouldn't recommend particularly using those now. It's always better to use live papers. There are the SAMs. The specimen papers are here. There's the specimen papers, and then the papers from the summer are under exam materials here. And then there's the question about The January papers, they're due on, I think it's the 5th of February. It was on the first slide. So Freya's just double checking about question 5. And this is a good example of why the question guides are quite helpful. So Freya is just asking about what question 5 looks like. So the easiest thing to do is go here, and you see that that the wording doesn't change at all. It's exactly the same every season, every series. Compare how the writers present their ideas and perspectives about their experiences. So I think actually when I was speaking before, I said something about the focus of the question, which is actually inaccurate. There's no focus to this question. It's a straight comparison. So there's always a specific focus to question 4, but there's not a specific focus to question 5 other than comparison. And so just close that, and I can just show you, I think it's the 5th of February for the, so the question papers will be on the website on the 5th of February for the January series, and a couple of weeks afterwards I will have updated the question summary that I was just showing you. So I seem to have missed a question about planning. So the plans themselves, so one of you is asking me, are there more marks if you plan your responses? So the plan itself is not marked or rewarded, but it is without doubt the case that responses which have been planned are better, stronger, more thought through, have better choice of references, range around the whole text better than those that are written without a plan, with the student just sort of scanning through the text and writing something as they come to it. So I'm not just saying that from personal experience, that's what the senior examining team say too. Okay, so I'm going to move over to literature. I'm just checking. So for those of you who don't teach literature, you probably could go if you'd like to. I'll just flag one of the things that I'm going to do is talk about language, form and structure, because a common question is this point language or is it structure, and what's the difference between structure and form? That may be of interest to you, because that obviously applies, the language and structure element applies to the language papers too, but there again you could just get it from the slides if you want to. Okay, so it's 10 to 5, we've got about 40 minutes left, and I'm going to start talking about English literature. So I'm going to take the same general approach, reminders about approaching the papers. I'm going to give you some help, as I said, on language, form and structure, and also on context. So I've got a couple of exemplars for you showing how context could be integrated into the literary heritage response. Okay, so as with the language, make sure that students write their responses in the correct answer spaces, and remember where assessment objectives are assessed and write on them in the right section. So I did show my presentation to the principal examiner for literature, and she specifically asked me to include those points because there are, she said that it is quite common for students to write about context where it's not assessed, for example. Also, when it gets near the exam, lots of teachers suddenly start thinking, oh my goodness, do the students get the poems in the exam or not? Yes, they do, don't worry. So for paper 1, students get a booklet with part 3 of the anthology, so with all the anthology poems in them, as a sort of insert into the question paper. So you don't need to provide a clean copy of the anthology for the exam, and students don't need to know the poems off by heart. They will have the poems in front of them. Just a reminder about the structure of the questions on the anthology poetry. Students always have a choice of 2 questions. One is on, so one question names 2 poems, and the other one names 1 poem and gives them the choice of a free choice of the second poem from the anthology. So as we said, as with the language, links and connections is only assessed in one place on the qualification, and that is on the anthology poetry, with 15 marks for the comparison element. So on paper 1, do use short or selective quotations and always comment on the effect. It is common for students under pressure to suddenly start writing very long quotes, and for them to have a long quote and not really say very much about what the writer is doing with the technique that they've pointed out. On section C, AO4 context is assessed on modern prose. So there are 20 marks for AO1 and 20 marks for AO4. So I do get quite a few queries about this. So just to clarify, students are not expected to physically devote an equal number of words to AO1 and AO4. They should integrate context points where they're relevant to the question focus. So they shouldn't just sort of regurgitate everything that they've learnt about the context of mice and men and just stick it down regardless of what the question is. And I guess I should flag, if you haven't already listened to it and you weren't there, I did go through an exemplar in the autumn network, so that's in the recording, where we looked at an example on crooks in Of Mice and Men and how the context was done in that. So so the message is, we're not expecting half of the essay on AO1 and half on AO4, and also do encourage students not to sort of over rely on historical context, and sort of end up with an essay which is more about context and doesn't have much in it about the novel itself. So the feeling after having read it is more that this is an essay on the context. It's not an essay about the text itself. Do be careful if you're using film version of texts, because they are often different to the novel. So whilst they are useful for getting students engaged, especially maybe if they're reluctant readers, it is important that you keep a focus on how the film is different to the novel, and make sure that they know that they need to write about the novel and not the film version. Moving on to paper 2. For modern drama, don't forget to comment on language and provide examples. So language tends to be a bit neglected. On section B, literary heritage text, this is the other place where context is assessed. So you've got one question on paper 1 where context is assessed, and one place on paper 2. And so for the literary heritage text, it's 10 marks for AO1, 10 for AO2, and 10 for context. And again, try to integrate the context points with a link to the question focus. In relation to coursework, just a reminder, this is again directly from the Chief Examiner, just be careful with overly complex or restricting title wording, because sometimes they prove difficult for students to handle. Obviously the coursework is the equivalent of paper 2. So if in doubt, you can take the exam questions from paper 2 and adjust them for use as your coursework titles. So the exam question is a good indicator of how sort of straightforward a coursework question could be. So Freya's just asking, is the context also where something features within the novel? So it is. So the novel itself provides a certain sort of context, but we're just going to go on. Let me just check where it's coming. I'll just flick ahead because we're talking about context. So in the specification, we outline the different kinds of context that you might talk about. So this is on page 12 of the specification. So, most texts that you study offer, there are many sort of, there's wide-ranging context material. So it shouldn't really necessarily be a question of sort of using the part to whole context, as it's sometimes called, of a single event within the context of the rest of the novel. And just to show you the range of points that you might make, I've just put some examples here. So in the Getting Started guide for ET1, there's a section on context and content for every text. So if in any doubt, then that's one place to start. So this, I've just copied out what they say about Macbeth. So like the first point, for example, is saying, that's about this play within the context of all of Shakespeare's tragedies. Then you've got historical context. Here it's sort of socio-cultural, the divine right of kings. And on the next slide, I just sort of summarized sort of the typical context points that tend to get covered in any teaching edition of a Shakespeare play. So these are the sort of areas that you might expect to cover with your students, and to sort of help them to integrate them into essays. So it is a question of them, of students learning how to weave the context points into their responses in a meaningful way, rather than, as I said before, just reproducing a block. If you are doing the coursework option, they obviously have got far more time to think about this, and they should be able to make a really good job of doing that. It's obviously slightly more demanding in an exam context because they are just confronted with a new focus and haven't had time to think about it. So I have got a couple of examples where I've just highlighted the context points. So I'll just show you these briefly by way of illustration. So these actually are from coursework pieces. So they're from, so they're the coursework on the literary heritage as opposed to the exam. And they're not particularly high scoring responses. This one, the first one on Romeo and Juliet, is level 3, I think. Yeah, level 3. And the second one on Macbeth is level 4. But I've just highlighted for you where context has been integrated and the type of context. So sort of identifying the genre is a type of literary context, and here the candidate puts this one play in the context of all of Shakespeare's tragedies. Then we've got a section on social historical context, marriage conventions in Elizabethan society. So this is relevant here, although you could say this is a bit of a block. bit of a learnt block. It is related to the question because it's how are different types of love presented. So in order to do that, it is relevant to talk about marriage conventions. And then the comment on the prologue saying that this was a common form of 16th century love poem. So again, that's literary contexting. You know, is it typical to open to make use of a poem in this way or not? And then the examiner's comment on this exemplar was that it's strong on AO2. There is some comment on context at the start, and the links are clearly understood. So there's not a great deal actually, but what has been done reasonably well. So that's on Romeo and Juliet. And then we could just have a quick look at a Macbeth one. Oh, where's my Macbeth gone? At the top. Here, sorry. So in this case, the focus was the Macbeth's madness is just a consequence from their crimes. How far do you agree? So here we've got quite a long section at the beginning on the historical context, when it was written, how it relates to history, linking to King James, and then this shows that Lady Macbeth is intent on corrupting the mind of Macbeth. In those times, witches were viewed badly. King James even wrote a book on the subject in which he called witches detestable slaves of the devil, etc. So that's historical context. And then, and again, this is relevant to the question of, is their madness a consequence of their crimes? And then some comments on what a Jacobean audience would have thought of the religious comments. And the commentary on this, there is an awareness of the relationship between text and context. However, some of the arguments presented are not always clear. So the context is not particularly strong here. So yeah, I'm sorry, I haven't been able to find so far some exemplars which really are kind of showing what brilliant context looks like. So I'm sorry, I'm sort of jumping around in the presentation a little bit, but it's just because I got asked the question on context, so I thought I would look at that there. So let's just go back now and look a little bit at language, form and structure. Here. So the questions that I quite often get are, does Edexcel count this as language or do they count it as structure? That's one question. And the second question is, what's the difference between structure and form? And do students need to write about both? And I guess it's the same question on language and structure as well. Do students need to write about both? They do need to write about language and structure. Structure and form are not always easy to distinguish, and they don't necessarily need to write about all three of these separately, i.e. in their plan, make a note of, oh, these are my language points, these are my structure form points, and these are my form points. There won't always be separate structure and form points. So I've got just some wording here which explains how things, so in general everyone's usually happy about language. I know what to write about for language. I can name parts of speech like adjectives, adverbs. I can look at literary terms like alliteration, personification, etc. But on structure, students often have a narrower repertoire of what to say. So often whether a point is considered as language or structure would depend on how the point is focused. So in the wording on this slide, I tried to show the difference between sentence structure, commenting on sentence structure as structure or as language. So here is just some examples of, so with structure, it's quite useful to think of the different levels at which structure might be commented on. Could be at sentence level or the paragraph level. So the length of the paragraph, often a varying length, and the use of discourse markers to link ideas either within the paragraph or between paragraphs. And then at text level, I've put a whole sort of range of things. When you're looking at the whole text, we can look at things like the different length of chapters, how much space a writer uses to talk about particular ideas, the use of framing devices, so, or something like the use of letters in a novel, or whether the narrative structure is chronological or non-chronological, foregrounding, that kind of thing. So I guess it's helpful when you're teaching to try to keep the different levels in mind and make sure that students know how to do all three. I guess the textbook for 4ET1 would help you on that. There are also some useful materials which were sort of intended for GCSE, but which would also be really helpful here. So as you probably know, we work with Deborah Myhill at the University of Exeter, and she's got her grammar for writing approach, which is where you analyse texts and become familiar with the different, what writers are doing, and then learn to name the different devices and then use them yourself. So in a minute I'll show you some published materials on that in case you're not familiar with them, but those sort of things. So the skills for writing books are really good at broadening students' repertoires of things to say about structure. And then here I've just commented a bit on structure and form. So form is sometimes genre effectively. So for poetry, it might be something like, what type of poetry is it? For prose, it's about maybe the different kind of categories of novels and how the text that the student's reading fits into that that hierarchy or taxonomy of text types. And it can be really empowering for students to, depending on which text you're teaching, to give them a sense of what those books can be like. They're not all the same, so it's more easy for them to comment on whether the writer is using typical approaches to a coming-of-age novel, if they've read more than one, or if they are aware of how that sort of text can be handled. And then you've got things like genre of comedy, tragedy, history, which might go across different literary genre, which can also be commented on. Okay, so I'm just going to come back to poetry now. So I already looked at the exemplar at the beginning of the session. So one of the other things that I was thinking about was how to, I was just thinking how, because lots of teachers asked me how to approach the comparison of the two poems. So I was looking around to see what resources we've offered. So I hope you've seen this, it's called a mop list. I can't remember what, meaning or purpose, right? That's why it's called a mop list. But on the website, you do have this structure for looking at the looking at 2 poems together. So you obviously have your approach to teaching the anthology poems. So when you've taught one, or when you've taught 2, you can take out this sort of sheet, for example, and use this as a kind of planning basis for comparing the 2 poems. So, I mean, you could teach poem 1 thoroughly, if you like, and then get them to fill out the poem 2 column from one that you've not taught yet. Because sometimes it's easier to think about what you can say for a poem if you've got something to compare it to. That's the joy of comparison, actually. So we've offered you that, and then we've also got this. So this lesson plan is also on the 4ET1 teaching resources page. It's a bit sort of wordy, but it has got some useful stuff in it. There's quite a lot on the skills that you can use when teaching it, but I thought there were some good ideas in it. Let me just come and see what I particularly liked. Oh yes, I rather like this. This is what I wanted to talk about. Sorry. So I hadn't thought about it for a while, but I thought that's quite a good idea. The idea of cutting up a exemplar and getting them to order it. So we looked earlier on at that exemplar on Search for My Tongue and Halfcast. So the sort of thing that is quite a fun exercise is if you or one of your students typed up that essay and maybe improved the structure even further, so made very clear links between the 2 poems, and then you chop it into paragraphs and then get them to reorder it, and that gives them an awareness of how important it is in a comparative essay to signpost for your reader where you're going with the comparison. And it's obviously the links between the paragraphs or the starter sentences, which I highlighted on that exemplar, which help the reader to understand where the student is going with the argument. So that would be a good way. I guess you could give them also an essay where the signposting isn't good, and that would demonstrate to them how difficult it would be to order the essay or to understand what the student's trying to convey, and then compare that with one that's got good signposting. Okay, I've got a couple of questions. So Freya just mentions the GCSE poetry support. We do have a sort of a section of support on the poems for GCSE, but I think for the international GCSE, we've got the published textbook, which has got an enormous amount of material in it. You know, it's over 300 pages, and so each poem is worked through quite thoroughly there. So I guess teachers have different approaches to teaching poetry. Many of them, like I typically, I'll start with the blank poem in the anthology if I don't know it, and I'll do my own annotation and take it from there. Often it's easier to teach a poem if you've really engaged with it yourself, rather than reading somebody else's sort of reading of it first. So I think there isn't any particular plan to produce more for the international GCSE poetry. I guess you've also got 2 series a year, and you've got 2 papers per series, so it means that you're getting lots of questions to look at, to think about how the poems are going to be paired. And I'm not sure if we're going to publish exemplars after every series, but certainly after every summer series we would. So you're going to have plenty of exemplars to look at. And then, of course, we did offer the pre-recorded exam feedback training, so that's also got quite a lot on the poetry. And also, there's nothing to stop you looking at the GCSE materials and sort of applying the same approach to the IGCSE poetry. And then Becky's just asking about where these resources are that I just showed, the mop list and everything. Well, they will be in the pack for this event. I've put all the materials there, but I'll just show you where they are otherwise. Course materials, teaching and learning, and so the mop list is here. That's the grid where you compare the two poems, and that's the lesson plan that I was just showing you. So yeah, I just went on to the website to have a look and see what we had offered. And then I think I'm right in saying that in the Getting Started guide, you've also got you've got a couple of lesson plans for individual poems here. And I think I'm right in saying that in the Getting Started guide, you've got, have we got the poems here or have we not got the poems here? We've got the texts. Yeah, we've got some of the poems. Yeah, we've got the poems here as well. So we've also got, you know, a basic starting point for your own sort of analysis of the poem in the Getting Started guide. Okay. Okay. Right, I think I've actually come to the end of the main content now, which is not too bad. I've got 10 minutes left, so I'll just take you through. So my contact details are here in case you don't have them. So you can reach me at Teaching English on that phone number or on Twitter. And also I do post things on the English forum to let you know what's available. So I think that is the end. So thank you very much for attending this afternoon. The recording will be available before too long. If you've got any other questions now, feel free to ask away and I will answer them. And if not, I wish you a safe journey home if you're not home already. And good evening. And I hope you're able to join me for any of the sessions that I'm running later in this term if you need help with the spoken language endorsement or making your submissions for the 15th of May. Yeah, and if you need to go, absolutely feel free to go. Otherwise, I'm very happy to answer any questions. So the first question is, are there any word limits? No, there aren't any word limits. The size of the space in the answer booklet is a rough indication of how much we think students might write, but there are huge differences in the length of response. Some students write extremely well, but also very concisely. Some students write a great deal, but their writing is not well organised and contains repetition. No, there aren't any word limits. Again, the best bet is to look at exemplars and to see how much has been written and what the examiner comments are. And then regarding the English student book, the extract night is not printed. Is it a mistake? I think that, I mean, we are, in general, we will be undertaking, when we reprint the student books, we will correct any errors that we find. I think that, I'm not entirely sure why night was not included, but it's not significant. Night is very much in the anthology. So whilst the student book attempts to be comprehensive, it is only a support for teachers, and it doesn't mean that because Night is not in there, it's not that's significant. So I'm sorry that it's not covered. I can certainly take that up with the publishing team and find out why it's not there and if it's going to be included in future versions. I guess it might be something like we couldn't get copyright to reproduce the extract. I'm not sure. I'll follow that up for you. Okay, so one person would like to see the textbook, where to find it, the student book. I shall just show you. So on any of our qualification pages, if you go to published resources, then you'll find published books. So the English literature student book is here, and as well as the book, there's also a teacher resource pack available. So it's just under the published resources tab there. And I did just say I'd show you on. I'll just show you something else. So this is our other publishing site. I was just mentioning the skills for writing. So this resource was originally, as you see, it's a Key Stage 3 resource. But it's a little pack of 3 textbooks or student books. And these are very useful for developing students' ability and their confidence in reading texts, understanding the techniques that writers are using in them, being able to name the techniques, and then also being able to then use those in their own writing and to write effectively about techniques. So these were the ones that I meant when I said they might help your students to broaden their repertoire of structure comments. It's very strong on structure. So they're called Skills for Writing. It's not particularly expensive either. It's a little pack of 3 books, and the idea is you can use them across different classes. So there's 3 different books. So if you've got a large school, you can use, all the book 1s in a class for a while, and the book 2s in a different class, and a book 3, and then swap it around.